Good evening, all. My name is Mehmet Saral, and as the President of the Advocates for Dignity, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. For those of you that don't know, Advocates for Dignity is an advocacy organization that seeks to promote the rule of law, democracy, and preserve fundamental rights. So we want to preserve democracy, preserve fundamental human rights and liberties with a special focus on Turkey and its citizens abroad. AFD is a non-profit organisation established by Australians of Turkish descent who seek to raise awareness about the injustices taking place to make the wider Australian community aware of the unlawful crackdown on the citizens and the cessation of press freedom in Turkey. Today is a special day. It is the United Nations International Day of Democracy. And to commemorate this day, this evening's webinar is titled The Unravelling of Democracy, the case study of Turkey. And tonight we have two distinguished speakers, followed by a Q&A panel with our speakers who will be moderated by a panel moderator. Our panelists include Professor John Keane, who is a professor of politics at the University of Sydney and also at the Wissenschaftszentrum at Berlin in Germany. He's also the co-founder and director of the Sydney Democracy Network. And Dr. David Tittensaw, who is a lecturer of studies of religion at Deakin University, Melbourne. Our two speakers will be asked a series of questions by the former ABC Radio National host, John Cleary. Without further ado, I will introduce our facilitator for the webinar, John Cleary. John Cleary is the former presenter of Sunday nights on ABC local radio. He's been described as one of Australia's leading commentators on religious affairs. He's a member of ABC's Specialist Religion Unit and is often heard as a commentator on religious issues for ABC Radio and television. He's best known for his years with Radio National as the presenter of the Religion Report, and prior to that, the philosophy program Meridian. He was part of the original Compass team on ABC television and was for several years a weekly part of the Triple J morning program with Angela Catterns and Jen Aldershaw. John has a keen interest in the intersection of state, society, and religion. I will now hand over to John to introduce our two speakers, and then we'll go to the Q&A session straight after that. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mehmet. Thanks for your welcome, and thank you all for joining this webinar marking the United Nations International Day of Democracy, of which the relevant United Nations resolution, when passed, declared democracy is a universal value based on the freely expressed will of people to determine their own political, economic, social, and cultural systems and their full participation in all aspects of life. In 2018, coinciding with the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN theme for Democracy Day was Democracy Under Strain. Well, this year's theme could be seen as an extension of that strand, with the Secretary-General naming COVID-19 as throwing a spotlight on democracy, stating that even in the context of COVID, quote, states must respect and protect, among other rights, freedom of expression and of the press, freedom of information, freedom of association, and of assembly. Well, each of which has resonance, not just over there, but dare I venture, even here in our own backyard. So in that context, it's a great pleasure to welcome our speakers for this evening, Professor John Keane and Dr. David Tittensaw. Each will speak for 15 minutes, after which there'll be around 20 minutes for questions, and you can enter these on the YouTube chat sidebar, and we'll filter them and pick up the ones that are probably, we hope, of most interest to you and our guests. Let me introduce then our first speaker. Dr. John Keane is Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney, as indicated, and at the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. He's also a director of the Sydney Democracy Network, and Professor Keane's most recent book is The New Despotism from Harvard University Press just this year. The New Despotism provides an account of the recent rise of regimes such as Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey, Khamenei's Iran and Xi Jinping's China. And given current trends in the home of democracy, it provides some insight into why despotism may be much closer to home than we care to admit. Professor John Keane, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John. I would like to say salem to you all and to those who have joined us. A special köszönem to Mehmet for having organized this. I'm very much looking forward as well to David's comments and to the discussion. This little green book has so far been mentioned a couple of times, and I want to do something, however, fresh that wasn't attempted in that book. I want to put on the table the question, how are despotisms built? Or turned inside out and put more provocatively, the question is, how are democracies destroyed? Well, we know from the historians and political thinkers of the past that there are times when democracies commit democide. They destroy themselves. There is no great agreement about the patterns, but there is agreement that there are moments when democracies become so twisted and stretched that they reach snapping point, and that they are replaced by a different way of handling power. There are, broadly speaking, two views that have been very influential. One is, it could be called the sudden death view. You know, it's that event that is dramatic, that destroys democracies. It's the March on Rome, organized by Mussolini's supporters, and the handing of power to him. It's the burning of the Reichstag, which the Nazis took great advantage of. It's Salvador Allende in Chile taking his own life in the presidential palace with troops milling at the doors of the palace. That sudden death view has a complement. There is a second type of view, which, let's call it the slow motion or the slow death of democracy dynamic. It places more emphasis on, for example, an economic depression or stagnation or depression, the social unrest that it generates, the street fighting that happens, the talk of revolution or radical transformations of the system. And according to this slow motion view, there comes a point, a breaking point at which there is a crackdown. And it can be, for example, the imposition of martial law, Thaksin Shinawat, and that whole dynamic in Thailand was ended, as we know, by a coup d'etat, or the way that Hamas's victory in 2006 in the legislative elections in Palestine was crushed, in effect, by military intervention and the arrest by the Israeli government, even of MPs and supporters of Hamas. Or more recently, this is the slow motion dynamic that led to the removal of Evo Morales in Bolivia. So they're the orthodox views. They're widely discussed in the literature, and historians tell us much about them. But what I want to say tonight is that things are now different. That there's a new 21st century dynamic, another type of destruction of democracy. Let's call it the killing of democracy in the name of democracy by despots and despotic politics. What do I have in mind? I think Turkey is showing how it happens or might happen if the supporters of democracy allow it to happen. In broad brush outline, This is a dynamic that you can see operating in a number of contexts today, in which the beginning point is that there has to be a cunning and tightly organized, well-disciplined political party that behaves as if it's got a hotline to the people. It begins to win elections, often at the local, for example, city level. Victory grants the party and its leaders capture and control of the governing institutions. Very often they may be decaying or in some kind of parlous condition. The success, the electoral success of this party convinces its leaders and followers that building up a base of loyal, compliant followers is strategically important, and that means winning support, for example, among the middle classes. Election victory tempts that governing party to begin kidnapping institutions. They kidnap the legislature. They neutralize the courts by denouncing them, for example, as a juristocracy, one of Erdogan's favorite words. They capture as well civil service or public service institutions and expertise. And they use those institutions in the process of capturing to play politics against their enemies, to weaken, politically crush their opponents. And all of this happens led by a big boss leader, someone who has a carefully crafted media strategy, using media wizards, as I call them in the New Despotism book, Errol Orchak, Surkov, who is was the original designer of Putin's image. This big boss leader begins, as time passes, to look more and more like a demagogue who's skilled at stirring up talk of democracy and the people, who warns against enemies and the possible collapse of law and order, with the backing of the police and the army, who are usually kidnapped in this process, and with a few whiffs of tear gas and pepper spray, the government of the people begins to round on its opponents. There are bans, initially temporary, then more permanent, on public assembly. There are internet crackdowns. There is a kind of camouflage violence which is used to target the opponents of the government of the people. They follow the rule that violence should be stocking masked, that there should be disappearances, that, as the old Chinese expression has it, there should be the killing of chickens to scare monkeys. And so there are arrests and detentions without trial, and unsolved murders and poisonings happen. There are sensational media accounts in which the opposition is implicated. Opposition party scandals are part of this dynamic. And there is talk of a possible coup d'etat. All of this alleged threat to public order is a dynamic in which courts and bureaucracies and other state institutions that were once designed for power sharing begin to look like empty shells, phantoms of their former selves. State power begins to turn steel tough. Lots of demagogic talk of democracy and the need for firm rule backed by the people. It grows louder and more militant. In this whole process, elections are of great importance. Elective despotism is born. That phrase was coined by Thomas Jefferson. Elections become rowdy, they become plebiscites. Politics morphs into spectacles. There's a kind of permanent campaigning and vote harvesting by the dominant party led by the demagogue. The party, led by the demagogue, uses state-of-the-art tools ranging from media message bombing and legal trickery to calculated silence and selected force. Something like a metamorphosis of democracy becomes visible at this point in the process. Democracy comes to be liquidated by restyling government as strong-armed rule, led by a despot, who center stage plays the role of guide and guardian of the people. Elections become much more than elections. They are elections without democracy. They are public rituals, they're carnivals of domination. They're a celebration of the mighty power of government endorsed by the votes of millions of people. But something else much less obvious happens at this point in the process that I'm describing, this transition from democracy to despotism. Here, what happens is that the people are redefined. Here I'm referring to a famous idea of the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who in 1953 wrote this poem called The Solution, in which it's a serious but also playful poem in which he says there are times when governments, fearing that the people are giving up on them, decide that the strategic priority is to elect a new people, and that elections can be used to effectively define a new people and to marginalize others who don't belong to the people. And this transition to despotism is one that features this attempt to, this solution, as Brecht called it, to actually redefine who counts as the people. And so in this process, the despots peddle doubts and fears. They move to ostracize people who don't belong to the people. Yes, there are many promises of betterment. There are new welfare payments. There are announced discoveries of oil and gas. New infrastructure is built under Erdogan. The number of shopping malls has increased more than 8 times. So the redefinition of the people involves payments and sinecures to those people, but it also involves marginalizing those who do not belong, who are enemies of the people. So a dynamic sets in which elections become exercises in electing an alternative people, a true and pure people, a pasteurized people who are said to be sovereign, the sovereign sources of authority in the regime. And this means that the original historical purpose of elections is turned upside down. The government does all it can to vote in a new people, and that involves exclusion of those who don't belong within that category. Well, when looking around us and taking this broad brush account seriously, I think we see that this dynamic can indeed take root in infant and underdeveloped and sickly democracies. Despotism in this respect isn't, I think, a replay of previous regime forms. The new despotisms of the 21st century are not old-fashioned tyrannies in which the bulk of the population are afraid and where brute violence is the main source of rule. These are not tin pot military dictatorships of the Mugabe kind in Zimbabwe. These are not fascist regimes. The bulk of the population is not mobilized and it does not fear generalized daily fear. They are not totalitarian regimes. They are not military dictatorships in any straightforward sense. They are not kleptocracies as some scholars of Putin's Russia claim. They're not autocracies in the sense that they're simply regimes where one man or woman rules. And I don't think it's helpful to call them hybrid regimes, a phrase that usually is confusing about the qualities that I've tried to describe in the book, and which I call despotism. And I do not think the dog-tired word authoritarianism captures the dynamic. The original usage of the term authoritarianism refers to a kind of rule that ultimately is rule by the fist. Striking is the way, as I've just described in the transition to despotism, striking is the way that despotisms, those who rule under despotic conditions, try to master the arts of winning the loyalty, the voluntary servitude of large parts of the population. There's one final thing to say about this transition from power-sharing constitutional democracy to despotism, and that is that the cases of Hungary, of Kazakhstan, and of Turkey, to name just 3 cases, show that a transition from democracy to despotism can happen rapidly. It doesn't take much more than a decade to do so. Of course, the local details differ, but the end result of this transition that I've described is generally the same. In the name of democracy, democracy is metamorphosed into a different political system. We could say the butterfly of democracy becomes the caterpillar of despotism. A weird new kind of polity, a new kind of phantom democracy is born. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so much for that. The beginning of a very stimulating line of thought, which I'm sure many of us will race to pick up your book and follow up. But to explore that in perhaps a way that's almost a case study, David Tittensor has observations for us. David is a lecturer in studies of religion in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University. His research interests include Muslim movements, Turkish politics and society, and religion and development with a focus on Islam. He's the author of The House of Service, The Gulen Movement and Islam's Third Way, and is a series editor for Muslims in Global Societies. David Tittensor, welcome.
Thank you very much, John. And also thank you, Professor Keane, for that very interesting and broad-ranging overview. I'm going to, as John pointed out, going to do a bit of a case study on Turkey. And I'm certainly going to pick up on some of those techniques that John mentioned in his review of the various different authoritarian regimes as I move through looking at Turkey, contemporary Turkey, I should stress. I'm going to look really from 2002 onwards, looking at the AKP. So I'm going to look at what I think is a multifactorial reasons as to why Turkey has sort of moved away from democracy. And in a similar vein to John, I'm going to do it in broad brushstrokes because I only have a limited amount of time. So naturally, there are other more nuanced elements that could be brought into it, but I'm going to sort of go through broad brushstrokes over a number of factors. So the first factor that I want to look at is EU accession, which has also been referred to as EU accession fatigue. Now, when the AKP first came into power, this was really the golden period. And there was a lot of optimism around AKP's election in late 2002 when they took office. And from 2002 to 2005, as I said, this was a golden period. And really what happened was this idea of the accession to the EU functioned as an anchor for Turkey during this period. As the formal accession negotiations were opened, and there was the prospect of Turkey becoming a full member of the EU. And so this allowed them to put in, as part of their campaign, a moderate and reformist program, which was very much in stark contrast to previous Islamist movements, particularly that led by Erdogan, of course, which Erdogan and the AKP, or the Justice and Development Party, was an offshoot. from, who was, as Erdogan, of course, being from the Milli Görüş movement, the National View, which was very much anti-EU in its orientation. And so as part of this process, they were seeking to meet the Copenhagen criteria. And in doing so, there was important strides that were made during this period to consolidate the development of democracy in Turkey through its reform package. I'm not going to go through all of the reform package, but some of the notable elements were, for example, the abolition of the death penalty. There was also, very importantly, initiating of a pathway of normalization in relation to the Kurdish issue. And this was done through offering cultural rights, which included the use of Kurdish language for both education and for broadcasting. And this was a significant departure, as previously the Kurdish issue had been viewed through the lens of security. And so a constant sort of oscillation between re-securitization and so forth. However, this anchor period kind of sort of started to ease off, or sort of decline, if you like, by around 2006. And there was fundamentally a loss of enthusiasm for accession. And this was partly to do with the fact that key European figures really put a lot of cold water on Turkey's accession to the European bloc. And these are very important figures in, for example, Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, who started to sort of frame up European Union as being very much sort of culturally different to Turkey, in the sense that it was very much a Christian bloc. Although they didn't say it explicitly, there were intimations that it was very much a Christian club, and that fundamentally Turkey did not belong in the European Union. For example, in middle of 2006, Angela Merkel made the statement, and I quote, "I underline my opinion that we need a European identity in the form of constitutional treaty. And I think it should be connected to Christianity and God, as Christianity has forged Europe in a decisive way." So this immediately put Turkey at odds, being a Muslim majority country. As you can see, Angela Merkel very much wanted to emphasize the Christian nature of the European Union. Similarly, Nicolas Sarkozy stated later that year in 2006, and I quote, "We have a problem of integration of Muslims that raises the question of Islam in Europe. To say it is not a problem is to hide from reality. If you let 100 million Turkish Muslims come in, what will come of it?" So again, what you have is you have this fear, again, of the Muslim hordes, which I think harks back to sort of a real sense of fear about this idea that these people who are culturally other are going to come in and fundamentally undermine the integrity of France and Europe more broadly. So again, what happened was, at that particular point, as Turkey was making strides to move towards European accession, there was a bloc that was forming within the European Union that was basically saying, "No, we don't really want them. We're just going to ruin what is effectively a Christian club and just undermine the integrity of Europe." And these negative perspectives, in conjunction with other moves that were made, firmly doused any enthusiasm amongst the government, but also in the broader populism. There was also a lot of fatigue and skepticism that started to seep into the popular and public opinion about the European Union, as well as because they wanted to change the nature of their accession program. In particular, they were in line with what Sarkozy said about this idea of 100 million Turks. Of course, there's only about 70, 80 million Turks, so it's a bit of exaggeration there. But they wanted to limit mobility of Turks. So they wanted to put a special caveat on Turkey and say that you can't have free access. So whilst other countries could have free access within, for example, Schengen and so forth, there would be limits on that. So basically what happened was, in the course of this EU accession, where they were striving to meet these criteria and democratize and meet the standards, they were saying that you're going to be a second-class member, if you like, within the European club. So we have to have special treatment. So even if they did achieve full status or full member status, they were always going to have an asterisk, that they weren't really fully fledged member of the club. And so this, as I said, really put a stick in the works, if you like, of European accession. And so that anchor of pushing and pulling Turkey towards democratization in the EU was somewhat taken away. So that's the first factor that I want to emphasize. The second factor follows on fairly shortly after this sort of cooling, if you like, of the relationship with the EU. And this is a constitutional court case that was brought against the AKP in 2008. Now, the Constitutional Court case was taken up by secularist forces with the often used claim against religious parties that they were undermining the secular nature of the state. And the allegations for this were, of course, based on two counts. The first of that was the selecting of Gül to run and become president. So this caused a furor amongst the secularist opposition, which was challenged and then overturned and so forth. And then alongside this, in 2008, you also had a move by the AKP to resolve what was seen as a religious issue, which is that of the headscarf, which has been a major stumbling block, if you like, in Turkey for a considerable period of time, about not being able to wear the headscarf and go to university and or to work in the public service. And so this was brought, and they were saying that they were undermining the nature of the secular state. And this was a very close run thing. And of course, Turkey's no stranger to party closures. And so they missed out on being closed by one vote. So this was a very serious warning shot across the bow by the anti-AKP forces. The indictment failed with a 6-5 verdict. 7 votes would have been needed on the 12-panel judge panel in order to have closure. However, there still was a backhander that came despite the fact that AKP survived. There was a unanimous vote to cut the party's funding by 50%. So they were significantly chastened, nonetheless, as a result of this process. And what this did, this attack on AKP and an attempt to close them by the secularist forces, was led to a fundamental repolarization of Turkish society along secular and religious divide. And indeed, what it would have done, and I argue it does, is it brought back a whole raft of memories about previous persecution at the hands of the secularist forces. For example, there's a range of party closures in the 70s. You had Milli Nizam Partisi, National Order Party in 71. You had then its follow-up, Milli Selamet Partisi, National Salvation Party, which was closed again when it ran from 1970 to 81. And then, of course, you had the 1997 soft coup, where there was the statement or memorandum put out to the Refah Partisi, a welfare party in 1997, which Erdogan declined to adhere to and closed the party down. And of course, the follow-up party again with Fazilet, the Virtue Party in 2001. So there's been a constant sort of oscillation of allowing religious parties into the political system and then shutting them out. So again, this attempt to shut them down again, as they've done in the past, would have brought back those memories of being shut out of the political sphere. I think also pertinent here, of course, in relation to Erdogan, who is the chief architect of the current circumstance in Turkey, was that, of course, he himself was jailed in 1999 for reciting a poem, which was which talked about the mosques being barracks and so forth, and served 4 months for that. And that poem was recited in 1997 when he was the mayor of Istanbul. So again, what this did is this repolarized society. So you had lost the anchor, which was the European Union accession. And then, of course, you had a repolarization following that with an attempt to actually forcibly shut down the Justice and Development Party. And what this did, this repolarization, it led to tit for tat. So the next factor is you had retaliation. And I guess this speaks again to what John was talking about before, using the system. And in this particular case, they engaged the AKP in, and as we'll see, with its tacit alliance, allegedly with the Gülen movement, instigated a couple of court cases against their opponents or the secularist forces. And these were designed to cripple the secularist opposition, and in particular were targeting the military to break what is seen as military tutelage. And the military for a long time were regarded very much as the guardians of the state. And so the first case, Ergenekon, was an indictment and was filed in 2008. And the first wave of the indictment targeted 86 people, which include retired army officers, politicians, lawyers, and journalists who were accused of planning assassinations and bombings, which were designed to sow chaos and force the military to step in and do a coup. So the idea was to force the military to step in and hit the reset button, as had been done in the past with previous coups when things were seen to have gotten out of hand. So to act again, for the military to act again as that the guardian of the state and keep Turkey on the correct path. Now with that trial, which ran from then up until 2013, And when it was completed, no less than 275 defendants were convicted, including former Chief of Armed Forces İlker Başbuğ. So again, the drive behind this was to neutralize the military, which was seen as the bulwark against allowing them to have their place in the political sphere, as they'd been closed down many times before. Now, in conjunction with this, with the waves of Ergenekon arrests and trials, there was another case that was also opened, which had the same agenda, and that was Balyoz, which means sledgehammer. And this was based on documents published in the daily newspaper Taraf. And the report alleged that in 2003, detailed plans had been drawn up for a coup by then First Army Commander General Çetin Doğan. The alleged plot was part of a war simulation attended by 29 generals and 133 officers, and involved plans to bring down a Turkish jet, bomb mosques, and establish martial law. Again, something that John also alluded to again as a technique, to enable a military cabinet. And the documents passed to Taraf formed the bulk of the evidence for the trial, which was completed on September 21, 2012, and saw no less than 331 retired officers serving their convictions. So effectively, through these two trials, what would ultimately be shown to be sham trials, as they were replete with forged evidence. For example, in one of the documents, it referred to Recordati Ilaç, which is, I think, a pharmacy company. And of course, the merger which led to that title hadn't happened at the time of the alleged allegations. So there were clear indications that there was forged evidence. And what this did is this broke the military tutelage. It neutralized the military by putting away many, as you can see, over 500 people, many of which were the military, were put away through these two rounds of trials, which overlapped with each other, as I said, from 2008 through to 2013. And ironically, Erdogan would later see all of the charges of both trials overturned in 2015 and 2016, in what I've actually called something of a deft maneuver. And respectively, he claimed that he was deceived in both cases by the parallel state, namely the Gülen movement. And I should just do a little bit of background on that. So I mentioned before that there was allegedly a tacit alliance between the Gülen movement and the AKP. And John talked about the state capture of the institutions. Well, in this particular instance, when the AKP came to power, another movement had been very diligently building a mass following in Turkey through its educational networks. There was around, conservatively estimated, somewhere between 500, maybe 800 schools, which were run by the Gülen movement in Turkey. And for decades, they'd been training people in all walks of life. So there were many people from the Gülen movement who were in the bureaucracy. And so during those trials, it's alleged that many of the people that helped instigate those trials were from the movement. And it was also reported in very positive terms in Zaman, which saw this as actually a step forward for democracy as well. And so he claimed, by virtue of having used them or perhaps working in cahoots with each other, as having been deceived. So all of a sudden, all of the fault was not at the hands of Erdogan, but was on the hands of the Gülen movement, which he now saw as a parallel state, or they called Derin Devlet, the deep state in Turkey, which now had to be removed. And so he transferred any possible blame from the AKP involvement onto the Gülen movement, which became the fundamental scapegoat for what was seen at these, now known to be these sham trials, which brings me to the next factor, which is effectively a civil war that broke out, or an intra-Islamist battle, if you like, between the Gülen movement and the AKP. And this time, what happened was, in 2013, as a precursor to this, there was a corruption probe against the Justice and Development Party, which saw 4 or 5 ministers resign on allegations of embezzlement, bribery, and fraud. The probe, perhaps more significantly, also threatened Erdogan himself. There are wiretapped phone calls, which are allegedly of Erdogan and his son Bilal, where he is reportedly telling his son that he needs to go and hide the money, which was apparently in boxes stored in various different properties. but it was also referred to being a montage, which is another line which often gets used to say that this was not indeed them, it was a fabrication. And this fabrication was also, again, placed at the feet of the Gulen movement. And was saying, so those people that were in the state used their authority within the police, within the judiciary, to make this maneuver. And as I said, so this went right to the top. And so as a result, this began a tit-for-tat battle between the Gulen movement and the government. And so in response to this perceived attack on the part of the Gulen movement, which he also said had deceived him in relation to those trials, he reassigned 96 judges and prosecutors. So he started removing people from their posts and from the bureaucracies who were now seen as being hostile to him and his ruling party. So 500 prosecutors and police were removed. And by January 2014, thousands of people within these state institutions had been removed from their posts. And this was just the beginning of a systematic dismantling that started to take place at the Gulen movement, which again had previously been an ally, also a part of a foreign policy soft power regime. So if you, for example, such as business associations like Tuskon, which was previously seen as being very positive, now everything had gone sour and everything had to be dismantled. So over the next 2 years, in the lead up to the coup, which I'll come to in a moment, for example, their bank, Asya Bank, was seized. So one of their major financial institutions was taken away, and that was in around May 2015. In the following year, Zaman newspaper, which was the leading newspaper, which often was reported as having a circulation over 1 million, was closed, and their archives were erased. And that was in March 2016. Not long after that, the Gulen movement was then formally declared as a terrorist organization, often used as FETÖ, so the Fethullahist Terror Organization. And that was in May 2016. And then, of course, it is seen as in response, perhaps in a last-ditch effort, you had the coup attempt of July 15, where it is alleged that it was purely the Gulen movement that undertook the coup. Although in my particular view, I think it was more of a disparate group rather than being solely on the Gulen movement itself. And he called this a gift from God. And the reason that I understand that he called this a gift from God was that he placed the blame solely on the Gulen movement. So again, much like he said he'd been deceived by the Gulen movement in relation to the use of this state bureaucracy against the military. He said now this was again the deep state, this was the parallel state, and continued and accelerated the crackdown. And of course, this could all be done now under the state of emergency following the attempted coup. And things really accelerated to the point where they seized $11 billion worth of assets from the movement. And it also went well beyond the movement as well. So it became an opportunity in almost a dragnet type situation where they basically started to wipe out anybody who was seen as a potential threat or form of opposition to the AKP. In particular was the HDP. So shortly after, the Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ were arrested, amongst others. Media outlets were shut down. There's been more than 100 media outlets now which have been shut down as part of the post-coup action. Journalists have been detained in significant numbers. Turkey is well down the list on the freedom list with somewhere of 120 plus or more journalists in recent years being in jail. They also went well beyond the movement, mostly with the movement in her book, to say that there was around 500 schools. There was more than 1,000 educational institutions shut down, so many other groups were also affected. Similarly, the higher education sector was decimated, so leftist intellectuals were jettisoned from their positions. In particular, 1,500 deans were sacked from universities across the country. So basically, the coup became a pretext not only to remove their former ally, which had been seen to turn against the AKP, but basically to get rid of any opponents that were seen as a threat to their rule. So to sort of sum up, basically what's happened since AKP came to power is that Turkey, without the anchor of the EU accession, which helped push them towards further democratization, I suppose, and consolidation of democracy, they certainly weren't a fully fledged democracy, began to drift back towards sort of authoritarian tendencies. And on this point, I think it's important to note that Turkey actually does have what I would call a political cultural problem. And that's there's a tendency to revere and reward the strongman in the political scene. And this is particularly reflected if you look at parties in the way that they operate, particularly also intra-party, as well as inter-party as well. And a good example of this is the fact that you very rarely see leadership change within political parties. Leaders hold on for grim death. You need a scandal, as like what happened with Deniz Baykal, in order to have leadership change. And usually when there is a problem within a party, rather than actually having leadership change, what you find a schism. And you'll find that Turkish history is replete with party splits. And this is because of that sort of the big man and who needs to rule the party with an iron fist. So it was sort of a regression, if you like, back towards this kind of sort of operating modality. And further, with the military being humbled, there was effectively no organization, as I mentioned before, to push the reset button, which had happened in previous iterations in 60, 71, and 80 and so forth, and 97 with the soft coup. So basically now without the driver of the EU, without the brakes that can be put on by the military, Turkey could regress to its sort of tendency to move towards authoritarian practice. And that's what's basically happened here. And we can see it's escalated, of course, with the subsequent 2017 referendum, where Erdogan effectively gave himself the super presidency. And I should just mention, in relation to speaking to what Professor John Keane was talking about before, of course, there were significant electoral irregularities, if you like, where upwards of 2.5 million votes that were questionable in relation to that election, which get granted in that super presidency. And so things have simply gone from there. So I think I think I've used up my allotment, so I think I'll hand it back to John, and we can perhaps open up to Q&A.
Thanks so much, David. It's a remarkable compression of a series of events, which to many people seem still very close to them. Let me ask a general question to get this kicked off. Both of you have presented a view in which despotism, or what we'd call despotism for the sake of this conversation, seems to be moving into a way into which it captures and can maintain popular legitimacy, albeit not through democratic means, but enough of a base to allow it to argue its legitimacy. Can either of you, perhaps John, we start with you, identify those elements which would lead one to suspect that this is not a long-term stable phenomenon? Or are you pessimistic? Are you saying, no, we're entering into a new era where this sort of stability can deliver the goods to people? Xi Jinping, I guess, is the best example. And so long as it delivers the goods, it's going to stay there.
Yes, thank you, John. I thought that one point missing from David's presentation, which was a remarkable sweep of very complicated events, is that nothing was said about the language, the political language through which the AKP and Erdogan are ruling. You've detailed moments, but I think that this question of what kind of legitimation, a regime of Erdogan's type pursues is really important for raising the question of how capable it is of winning sufficient loyalty to produce a kind of resilience within the system. I mean, no regime can indefinitely rule through the fist, through fear. Voluntary servitude, on the other hand, can be a glue that that actually gives great resilience to a regime. I think that in the Turkish case, as an outsider, I'm very struck by the polysemic quality of the AKP and Erdogan's speech. You know, there is talk of gifts from God. There's lots of talk of the people. There is talk of true democracy. There is increasingly anti-European sentiments. There's talk of an Ottoman, you know, great Turkic civilization. There's talk of economic growth. When you put all of that language together, it doesn't congeal. I mean, it's not consistent. And yet one of the features of all the new despotisms is that they don't rule through an ideology, you know, a strictly defined, coherent, big picture of the world that answers every question about what is to be done. They have, I call them vaudeville governments. You know, they've got jugglers and fire eaters, and they've got wild animals, and they display those, and that gives them a great tactical advantage. So that's to raise the question of, in the Turkish case, of how much loyalty, what do we know about the loyalty for the great man, for the AKP, and for the restructuring of the Turkish, you know, political economy that's gone on. I think that's a very central question. I happen to think as well that this question finally is not well enough analyzed through the language of authoritarianism. David, you still use this old term. It has a very tainted history. It's coined in the early 70s by Sam Huntington and Juan Lintz. It's a term that is the twin of liberal democracy, American style. It's a term that doesn't well capture the voluntary servitude, you know, the winning of the loyalty of subjected people by a regime, because it, in the end, says that the regime is self-authorizing, that it ultimately rests on the fist. I think that's to underestimate the tremendous capacity of winning elections and building a party and doing the state restructuring, the deep state restructuring, the naming of enemies. I think all of that process is very important to understand. And here I put on the table the thought that actually Erdogan's Turkey, as Lukashenko's Belarus, as Orban's Hungary, as Putin's Russia, as Xi Jinping's China, are a good deal more resilient. And we shouldn't underestimate their resilience, even in the face of sluggish economic growth, which can be overridden by techniques of winning the loyalty of people using different language.
David.
I agree with John in the sense that I don't think that there's a coherent ideology. I think that's a really good point. And I would say that Erdogan is the pragmatic operator par excellence, and that he will do what he feels needs to be done at the critical juncture. So they will shift, they will adjust their position, and they will come up with a new narrative as they see fit. If there's a lag in the votes, if there's, you know, a new story that needs to be told. So I think that's very true. I think that he's a very clever, cunning, pragmatic operator who will put things on hold if it's not working and move to a different approach. And you can see that with the Kurdish issue, which has sort of oscillated on and off for an extended period of time. When new exigencies present themselves, they might be, well, that's not something we should pursue at this moment, so we'll move to something else. Yes, so I think that is very much the case. In terms of resilience, I'm not as convinced in the case of Turkey that how resilient the regime is. I mean, with for example, the 2015 election and the reset election, Turkey lost a lot of ground at that one. Particularly prior to that, they'd been going up, up, and up, and up almost getting 50%, which is almost unheralded in Turkey. They lost around 8-9% in that 2015 election. The Kurds did very well, getting past the 10% threshold. And then there had to be, there's allegations of sort of manipulation and voter suppression and stuff like that in the reset election, which was held in November. And of course, subsequent to that, they've moved into an alliance with the ultranationalist party. So that to me suggests that there has been a waning of support for them. And again, but that also speaks again to the pragmatism of Erdogan doing what is necessary to prop up the regime. So I think that there are cracks that have formed, and so to really be about what tricks that Erdogan can pull out of his bag next in order to see how it's going to flow. But I think there's definitely, it has been a weakening, but certainly I agree with largely with what John has said.
Can I ask one brief, David, I'll get you to respond to this, and then John, you might. Geopolitics, the extent to which this plays into it, and I'm thinking particularly of, say, Turkey's relationship with Russia, with Putin. I mean, there is a history there that goes back many, many decades, a couple of hundred years. In fact, do those factors play into this at all?
Well, again, I think if you look at the foreign policy, Turkey's foreign policy has been, they haven't got a great history in terms of relationship with the neighbors. You had obviously David Olu's very ill-fated zero problems with the neighbors policy, you know, and for example, they tend to flip-flop. For example, the Russian relationship has gone hot and cold in recent times, but it's based on the need. You know, so again, depending on what happens, Erdogan will change his tune, as we saw with Assad. They were friendly, and then it became unpalatable to be friendly because of what was happening in Syria. So that relationship shifted, and we've seen a cooling and a heating up of relationship with Russia. For example, you know, getting the S-400 missile system with Russia, which is angering the US, and of course goes against NATO interoperability and so forth. I think, again, being pragmatic, he's going to see what's going to get him the most play, perhaps domestically, from these relationships and shoring up their position. For example, might be seen as being standing up to, you know, pressure from the US or something like that. So again, I see these relationships as being shifting based on what he sees his perceived need is at that particular time. It feeds into the pragmatism.
John.
Two things very briefly. I think that the yearnings for empire are not dead inside Turkey. And indeed, one way of understanding this dynamic that David described so well is that there is that nostalgia, and there is talk of rebuilding a state that's a civilizational state whose power actually spills beyond its borders, you know, into Libya, for example. And in this sense, this transition to despotism, as I call it, you know, is entangled with geopolitical forces. One thing that is not to be underestimated is the way that the new despotisms hunt in packs. They share intelligence, they share techniques of how you deal with the internet, you know, to control the internet. They do gas and oil deals, they're engaged in weapons arrangements, sales, and so on. That's not to be underestimated. One other thing that I think is worth just underscoring, David put it very well, is the striking failure of the European Union, which had pursued a different democratization model than the Americans. You know, the Americans, Iraq is a case in point, you do it through firepower and then somehow magically democracy is meant to happen. The European Union model was different, but this was, you've described it as, I think very well, it's an instance of democracy failure. It was the Sarkozy-Merkel talk of a Christian Europe that actually is co-responsible for the birth of a despotism on the edges of the European Union. It's a great unintended consequence, and I think it will prove to be a great burden for the European Union in the years to come.
We've run out of time, but I'm going to ask one cheeky little question, John, to you. And that is, everybody is looking at the USA today and saying, what on earth is this phenomenon called Trump? And what are the tendencies there? And people are talking about things like sort of, authoritarian leanings, about populist democracy, about the nature of it. And we're also looking at Brexit with the same thing. People are saying there's trouble at home as well. Our own democracies aren't functioning all that well, and the strong leader has an attraction.
Yes, I didn't mention number 45, as I call him. I don't use his name anymore. It's my way of remaining optimistic. With a bit of luck, there might be a 46th president. But I took it that everything I said in my opening remarks was actually a description of what number 45 and the Republican Party is doing. The taming of Congress, effectively the co-optation of the Supreme Court, the downgrading of federal bureaucratic institutions, the attacks on sectors of the media being called fake news, the demagoguery, the constant talk of the people. I mean, this is how you build a despotism. That word is still not greatly in circulation in the United States. There is talk of fascism. I think it's a misdescription. There is talk of simple populism. It doesn't go deep enough for me. And lots of talk of authoritarianism. I think this is much more dangerous because the core idea in the category of despotism is the problem of voluntary servitude. That top-down power, armed, plutocratic, corrupt, can nevertheless win the loyalty of millions of people. That was the great strength of the historically of the category of despotism. And it does seem to me that the American case is one where there is something of a life and death battle that we're now witnessing that could all end very badly indeed, at the point at which, of course, the despot in the making declares the election a fraud. And then there is something of a constitutional crisis in the American Republic.
Well, we have to thank you both. David, for giving us a window on a particular series of events which illustrate wonderfully the broader thesis that John has outlined to us tonight. Thank you both so much. Back to Mehmet Sarel. Mehmet.
Hello.
Yes, Mehmet.
Yes. Can we get the video back on, Barack? So here we go. Got it. Thanks. Thank you to our two speakers, John and David, for the great insights you have given us to our listeners on despotism and the demise of democracy in Turkey. And thank you to Professor John Keane. He did describe the new despotism, which is the title of your new book. And what intrigues me most is that the new despotic states, Hungary, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, transformed from a democracy to a despotic state within 10 years. So it is not hard to do. And that's really, I can't wait to grab a copy of your book and read it to understand the mindset of these type of leaders. And hopefully we don't get a similar type of leader in the US in the future. As for Dr. David Titensor, you've taken us on the journey about the plight of Turkey since the Erdogan regime came to power in 2002 until now, and how the country peaked as a democracy in the late 2000s and to plunder into the doldrums of a dictatorship only a decade on. And thank you to you too, John Cleary, for the insightful questions you have asked, as you always do, to educate our viewers. I used to love listening to you on Sunday nights with John Cleary on ABC a few years back. You always amaze me at how well you research the person that you interviewed on every night on that program. And you have done the same tonight in researching both the works of Professor John Keane and Dr. David Tittensaw. And finally, I would like to thank all our viewers for taking time out of their busy schedule to watch our third webinar. I look forward to see you in all our virtually to see you in all our next event, which is also a webinar, considering the times that we live in. So please look out for those on our upcoming webinars on our website at advocatesfordignity.org.au. Goodbye, everyone, and talk to you next time.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks very much, guys. That was great.
Excellent.